Well, now we're into Esther chapter 7. Holy cow, the stuff that's been going on is just so amazing. So, in this chapter, we get this is the second banquet, remember, the second day of banquet that the queen has put on for the king. And then they invited Haman as one of the king's most closest servants to come to this. And so he's got to come after he was humiliated the earlier that day or later, probably earlier that same day, basically, he was humiliated by having to take Mordecai around and do all this stuff when he was trying to kill Mordecai. So we're going to see as this comes together, Esther knows of the plot to get rid of Mordecai, and so we're gonna look into this and see what's going on. This is going to be an interesting conundrum that we're going to have to deal with Haman, or that he's going to deal with basically. So verse 1, so the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther the queen. And the queen said again, and the king, said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee, and what is thy request? And it shall be performed even to the half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. So she's asking for the lives of the Jews, basically. And she says here, for we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. And when King Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? So let's pause here for a second because there's more to this story than what we're getting in these verses, basically. So we want to look at this, okay? Because what's happening here is, remember, the king's going, hey, queen, what is it you want? And she says, you know what? I'll tell you what. I'm going to put a feast on for you today. Come and let's bring Haman, let's bring Haman, your advisor, on as well, and let's have a feast. And they go to the feast, and then the king says, hey, Esther, what is it that you would like from me? You haven't asked a request of me. And she says, you know what? I'll have a party tomorrow. Let's talk tomorrow about it then. Let's just enjoy it today. I'll throw another banquet tomorrow and we can talk then. So then the whole thing between Haman and Mordecai unfolds with the king. And now we're on the second day of the second feast, basically, on the second day. And now the king's going, what is it that you want? And she says, basically, I want to be in control of my own life. I want let my life be given me at my petition. I want to not die on this edict, basically, and my people at my request. Basically, I want to stop the death and the destruction of the Jews, my people. And she says, basically, in verse 4, look, we are captives in Babylon, basically. We were sold off as slaves. If we had been sold into slavery, I wouldn't have said anything about it. We're kind of used to that, unfortunately. But we are slated to be executed throughout the entire kingdom. And in verse 5, the king's going, okay, well, who is trying to execute the Jews? So this gives us a little bit of a background here to realize if we were to go back several chapters to when Haman talked to the king about this edict, Haman probably wasn't forthcoming with the Jews, with his story of the Jews. He's probably like, look, the Jews are going to violate your laws. Let's banish them from the kingdom. Maybe that's what he originally meant, was let's just banish them from the kingdom. Okay, that sounds good. Banish from the kingdom. Then Haman turned the story a little different when it got to the printing press. And he said, nope, the king wants the Jews executed. If they aren't, they can leave the kingdom, but if they're not gone by this date, they will be executed, basically. I don't think the kings knew that part, that he had put a date on it, it sounds like, basically, to execute him. So there might be some more to this story of what's going on. Haman might not have been fully truthful with Xerxes at this time. So verse 6, so Esther's going to answer the king, because the king's asking, who is this person who wants to destroy them? And because that doesn't make sense. Why would I want to kill that many people in my kingdom? That would be a bad thing for me. So, and Esther's like, I know that would be a really bad thing. That wouldn't go well for your kingdom to execute an entire nation of people. So, and he's like, well, who is this? So verse 6, and Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. So they're sitting here having this party, the three of them, and Esther's like, and the king's like, hey Esther, what is it that you want? And she says this whole thing, I don't want to die, and I want to preserve my life and the life of my people. This might be the first time Haman has heard that Esther is a Jew. I wouldn't be surprised if he's going, oh crap, I hate the Jews, but the queen's a Jew. Oh, this isn't going to go well. His whole plan is unraveling before his eyes. His ego is going to be trampled on again. And so Haman's a little afraid now because his edict is to kill all the Jews, and that's the queen. And that means I put an edict to kill the queen. And that is, there's other laws that say if you try to kill the king and queen, you are punished by death. So his rule is now in violation of these other rules to preserve the king and queen. So there's a problem here. Not to mention the king likes the queen, and so to follow the rule, he has to kill his wife. That's not going to work. So Haman's in a bad spot, basically. He's afraid. Verse 7, and the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. So he's getting up, and he left. And Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. The king, so let's pause for a second here. The king's probably like, what are you talking about? Is this really true? And Haman's like, I don't know. He's probably trying to stay out of this. So the king gets up and he leaves the party. He goes out to talk to his other servants going, is this true? Is there an edict with my stamp on it that we're going to execute the Jews on this date? And so they probably said, yes, there is, king, and here's one of the letters of it, and there's your stamp and everything else. And he's like, oh my gosh, this is not what I wanted. This is not, Haman has lied. This is not what we wanted. So Haman's in with the queen going, oh crap, the king's about to find out I lied to him, and this is all going to unravel. So his only hope is to beg the queen for mercy, to gain his life, to please help me out here. Please help me out. So verse 7, verse 8, sorry, we just read verse 7. Verse 8, then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So here's what's happening here, basically. He goes out, Haman comes over to the queen saying, please, you got to help me here. Now, they use the word bed in here, in this translation, and in the Old Testament study guide, they clarify this a little bit. It says, the Hebrew word translated in verse 8 as bed may have been a couch or a place of reclining. It seems likely that Haman rushed over to Esther at the banquet and fell on her couch to plead for his life. The king's abrupt departure from the banquet may have been prompted by a desire to check Esther's story with some of the other aides in the court. When the king returned to the banquet, he interpreted Haman's position as a sexual advance and ordered his death. Thus, with no direct suggestion by Esther about what Haman's punishment should be, circumstances brought about the swift execution of the man who could have proven, even after his fall from favor, to be a powerful enemy to the queen. So this is the challenge here, and this is fascinating because Esther hasn't done anything but thrown two parties. And all of this has happened. I think that definitely shows, one, the wisdom of women to be indirect about things and let men discover stuff in a way, kind of put them in a position so that they kind of discover things. And more importantly, really, the wisdom of following God. I'm sure there's a good chance that Esther's inspiration for these two parties was given by God. She probably didn't fully understand how this was going to work. But now suddenly this is all unfolded. And she doesn't have to know all the things about, Mordecai. Haman wanted Mordecai to be executed and talking to the king and stuff like that. She knows that he has put this edict out, and he changed the king's words, basically. And the king's now pissed. And now the king comes in and sees Haman right up next to his wife, and he's probably like, wait a minute, is he trying to make an advance on my wife? Is he trying to force rape my wife, basically, maybe. And that's kind of what he says there, basically. Will he force the queen also before me in the house? Is he trying to rape my wife? Is he trying to get his way with my wife? What's going on here? So he is really, not only is he mad at Haman, but he's even more mad at Haman because of it, you know. So verse 9, and Harbonah, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. So when the word of the king went out of the king's mouth, when he talked about this, they covered Haman's face, basically, in verse 8, because they're realizing the king's pissed at Haman. Haman needs to not be in the presence of the king anymore, basically. So they covered his face, so the king couldn't have to see him. And then they said, and then the chamberlain, of course, is like, "Hey, Haman actually built gallows. Now, why did he build gallows 75 feet high? That's what, 2 stories tall gallows. So whoever's hung on those gallows is going to be high enough that a lot of the area around is going to see him. Most people will be able to see them from all over the place." He wanted to make an example of Mordecai. It ended up he got hung on those gallows and was made an example, basically, is what happened there. So that is the end of Haman and that crazy story that we have. So let's see what happens next. Is now we have to deal with this edict. This edict is still out there. It was translated into multiple languages. It was sent all over the kingdom. It probably took 3 or 4 weeks at least to get to the other side of the kingdom from Babylon. So now everybody knows of this date. Now they've got to figure out all this communication. How do we get the word out that this doesn't happen? This isn't what the king wanted. Here's the other problem. The king has his stamp on it. The king has made it an irrevocable decree, which means the king can't just go, just kidding, I didn't want to say that. That was wrong. That would lose face in the sight of the people. As the king, he can't call back an irrevocable edict. They have to do something about this. And that's what we're going to learn about in the next chapter. So we'll see you over there.